You've probably heard that you need $1 million or more to retire. But if that were true, then how do so many people retire every year with far less? In today's video, I'm going to show you why the $1 million rule might be one of the most misleading ideas in personal finance and what actually matters if you want to retire at 60. So let's break this down. So first, we need to take a hard look at what retirement actually costs and why the $1 million rule doesn't hold up when you factor in real-world variables like where you live, how much you spend, and what kind of income you'll actually need. And we'll start by looking at how many people actually retire with less than $1 million and why it still works for them. You know, the $1 million to retire figure, it's repeated quite often, but when you dig into the actual numbers, something surprising emerges. And it's the fact that most retirees don't even come close to that benchmark. So there was one study put out by the Federal Reserve a few years ago, and what it showed was that the average retirement savings for people between the ages of 55 and 64 is around $400,000. And then for people aged 65 to 74, it's about $426,000. And you know, obviously those are just averages, and so you've got some super wealthy people skewing that upwards, and then you've got, you know, a lot of other people have virtually nothing in there, right? But no matter what, the reality is that many retirees have far less. So how are they doing it? You know, I'd argue that the crux of it is that you don't need to hit some magic number just to retire. What's far more important is how you structure your life and spending. So, you know, one simple thing to look at is where retirees live and, or even choose to live in retirement. And a lot of them choose to live in places that are lower cost. And that might mean like the Midwest or the South. And look, guys, I mean, I get it. You know, the indignity of living in a flyover state, I don't know how anybody could bear that, but some people actually do, and what they find is it's way, way cheaper than living in coastal cities like LA or New York and so on. Now, also a lot of retirees will move to lower cost places like you've got Mexico, maybe Portugal, Ecuador is kind of a popular one that comes up. Something else that is going to make a big difference for you is healthcare costs. And so some of these retirees, even with less income, they do everything they can to stay healthy and avoid costly medical expenses. Obviously, you know, you can only do that to a certain extent, but, you know, they still tend to have healthier lifestyles. And then a lot of them, they simply live more intentionally, right? And they focus on experiences over accumulating stuff. And, you know, I've tend to deal with a lot of the millionaire next door type people. And that is almost always the most common denominator. To a T, the vast majority of the people that I've dealt with that are, you know, that millionaire next door type, they're not the ones buying the $120,000 luxury sedan or spending $100,000 on a truck all the time. You know, they tend to drive Toyotas and they tend to drive them until the wheels fall off. And that's a big difference. But going back to it, so how do people do it? Well, the point is, you know, retirement's not a one-size-fits-all formula. And your location, lifestyle, flexibility, that all those things are going to drastically reduce how much you actually need in retirement. And now look, that's really important if you're thinking about retiring at 60 because, you know, while that might seem a little bit early, you know, being just 5 years away from Medicare and a few years away from Social Security, that kind of creates a unique window. And if you can bridge the gap with a smart strategy, you don't need to stretch your money across a 30-year, you know, kind of like unknown situation, right? And, you know, the bottom line is retiring at 60 with under $1 million is more common and more doable than most people realize, but it's only going to work if you focus on the right variables. But I think, you know, that begs the question, so if savings alone doesn't determine your retirement success, then what does? And, you know, I'm going to argue that the answer is income. And specifically, how do you replace your paycheck once you stop working? So let's go over a simple example, right? Like, let's say you've got $950,000 saved and, you know, to you, that might not sound like enough, but If you also have a pension that's paying you 30 grand a year, well, now the math starts to change, right? So instead of relying solely on your withdrawals, you've got a reliable stream of income that's going to reduce how much you need to pull from your portfolio. And you could think of it the same way as like income from your portfolio. You might have rentals or, some people have annuities and things like that. Something else to consider, right? Maybe you don't have a pension, right? I think it's like only 15% of people do, but what if you plan to work part-time? I've always been kind of surprised at how often I'll have clients do that and the fact that they're actually able to. And so that, in my experience at least, has been more common than I thought. And so, look, even if you just earn like $10,000 to $15,000 per year for a few years, that can actually dramatically extend the life of your savings. And, that might add a year or two to the bottom line because you didn't have to draw that. And then it was actually earning a return and compounding on top of it. I would think in terms of income replacement and not just your account balance. So let's look at an example. Let's say your expenses are 60 grand a year, and between Social Security, pension, or part-time work, or maybe rental income, whatever, you bring in $35,000. So that means you just need to bridge the gap with another $25,000 a year in savings. And look, that's way different than trying to cover the full 60 grand from your investment portfolio of 950,000, because that's going to kind of put you in the danger zone, as far as having a withdrawal rate that's higher than 6%. It would be hard to kind of sustainably do that throughout an entire retirement. But 25 grand, that's completely doable for most people. And so, just going beyond income, right? The other important factor here is your withdrawal strategy. So, a lot of people think about the 4% rule, and that suggests that on $1 million portfolio, you could withdraw 40 grand a year and then add inflation and so on. But you got to think that rule was designed for a worst case scenario. And in practice, being flexible with your withdrawals, spending less in bad years, a little more in good ones, that's going to make your money last a lot longer. And so, the question isn't like, oh, do I have $1 million? It's more like, how much income can I reasonably expect, and what's the most efficient way to generate it? So, the first thing you're going to want to do is build a sustainable income plan. And then once you've got a sustainable income plan, the next step is making sure that you keep as much of that income as possible. And this is where the tax strategy becomes incredibly relevant, especially for retirees with under $1 million saved. But, it doesn't really matter, right? Taxes always kind of move the needle, and all is equal. You want to pay less. So, thinking about that withdrawal strategy, the traditional advice you hear is that you should draw down your taxable account first, then move on to your tax-deferred pre-tax accounts. That's like a 401k or, a regular traditional IRA. And then finally, your Roth IRA last. But let me tell you guys, this is really going to differ depending on your situation. And especially if you retire under 60, managing your tax brackets makes a huge difference. So I'll give you an example. I'm literally working on a plan right now and it's, this couple, they're under 60. They've got to bridge the gap between when they retire and then Medicare. And, when I play around with the cash flows and the tax situation, and then importantly, look at how much they're going to pay in healthcare premiums, the correct order for them is we're going to draw down their taxable accounts first. This is going to keep them in a very low income bracket, so they're going to be able to be on ACA, keep their healthcare premiums like below a couple $100. But then they're going to run out of that money, and then the question is, what do you do next? And it's not just take from their tax deferred, because that's going to blow up their income, and they're going to pay a lot more in healthcare premiums. So what we're going to have to do is blend and manage their tax bracket. So part of what we're going to do is take from their IRA. Part of what we're going to do is take from the Roth, and we're going to manage their brackets, and we're going to be able to manage their healthcare premiums as a result. And so for successful retirees, even below that $1 million range, I mean, this can make a really, really big difference. And honestly, for those next several years before they get on Medicare, that's going to save them thousands of dollars just by managing their tax brackets like that. And it goes against, conventional wisdom. Something else to think about, for people retiring at 60 or maybe a little bit before, those first 5 to 10 years before Social Security and then required minimum distributions kick in, that's a golden opportunity, right? Because you're going to be in a much lower tax bracket. And that means you can convert portions of your traditional IRA into a Roth, never have to pay taxes again on that at a relatively low cost, because all of a sudden, you're in a pretty low tax bracket. And so if you do this right, that kind of planning can increase your long-term spending power. What you've done is you've decreased how much you would have paid in taxes over time. Depending on the size of the portfolio, I mean, usually that's, maybe $100,000 plus. And what that actually means is that, it's also a lifestyle win too, because that means you could actually spend more than you otherwise could, because that savings kind of just drops to the bottom line for you. And that really, ultimately could result in more income. Okay, so now that you understand how tax optimization makes under $1 million retirement viable, you can fill out the questionnaire in the description, and I'll send you a personalized video analyzing your specific situation. And I'll try to show you exactly how to determine if you can retire at 60 with your current savings level. All right. And now let's pivot over to healthcare. And we've already kind of talked about that, but that 5+ year gap between 60, let's say, or, maybe a little bit younger, and Medicare eligibility is often the make or break factor in early retirement. Because what I hinted at earlier, one of the most common concerns about retiring at 60 or younger is healthcare. What are you going to do for health insurance, to bridge that gap before it kicks in, or before Medicare kicks in at age 65? And it's a big question, but it's definitely not insurmountable. And in fact, that 5-year gap, I think, is a lot more manageable than most people realize. And it goes back to exactly what I just discussed earlier. So, as long as you can be thoughtful about your income and how it affects subsidies, it's a problem that most people can solve. So I'll give you a little bit of insight on the Affordable Care Act. So if your income is low enough in retirement, you might qualify for premium tax credits under the Affordable Care Act. And these tax credits, they can drastically reduce your monthly health insurance premiums, literally like hundreds or maybe, like $1,000 a month or so, depending on how low your income is. And that's even for, some, I think, pretty decent plans with solid coverage. And because you have more control over your income in retirement, because look, you're not going to be working. And so that income's gone all of a sudden. Now it all goes down to, okay, how can I engineer my income to stay below these subsidy thresholds? And that goes right back to the strategy I just discussed before, where the withdrawal sequence and the managing of tax brackets is extremely important for you. A couple other things to think about if you have a spouse here is that, other strategies can help too outside of the ACA. So if your spouse is still working, you might be eligible for coverage under their employer plan. And if you recently left a job, COBRA can provide, like a temporary extension of your old coverage, giving you, I don't know, it depends like how many months you can get, but you'll have some opportunity to bridge the gap there. Now, COBRA can be quite expensive in my experience, especially compared to ACA, but at least it's something. And again, I mean, the key point here is that, the healthcare gap between 60 and 65 doesn't have to be a deal breaker. And so if you integrate healthcare planning into your retirement strategy and coordinate it with tax planning, then it just becomes another piece of the puzzle, right? And, it's one of the reasons why I say that retiring at 60 with less than $1 million is far more viable than most people think. And I think the other factor to discuss here is lifestyle. At the end of the day, how you live in retirement is going to matter more than how much you saved. We already talked about relocating to a lower cost area, right? If you live in the Midwest or South or, any of those other kind of international destinations, that could make a huge difference. But so does lifestyle. So I always marvel at this. We used to have a client back when I was out in Arizona, and Arizona, again, kind of middle of the pack. It's kind of expensive now, but this was a few years ago, and this client of ours, he was not very wealthy at all. In fact, he only had about like $400,000, okay? But I've never seen anyone before they could just live off of Social Security. And this person and his wife, too, they did it, okay? So they literally would give us money at the end of every year to invest more. It was crazy. And they were just incredibly frugal. They had their house paid off. They did live in the West Valley, so they weren't in the more expensive areas of Phoenix, like, Paradise Valley or Scottsdale and so on. And it worked for them, and they were totally fine. And it was all about lifestyle, and they were happy. I mean, they honestly had the lifestyle that they wanted. They went hiking and just kind of stayed active in their community, and it was fine for them. So, something we talk about all the time around here is really everything comes down to trade-offs, right? And you might not be able to have a membership at the country club, or you're not going to be able to take expensive luxury vacations, or at least you're going to have to limit how often you can take those, and so on. And, the way that people with less money tend to have a successful retirement is just, they're focused on simple pleasures, guys. Spending time with family, staying active, engaging with their community. And those things don't require $1 million portfolio. Something else, lifestyle flexibility, right? That's a huge advantage. So if you have the ability to adjust your spending during down markets, and maybe that's delaying a big trip when the market's rocky, or temporarily reducing your withdrawals until your portfolio can recover, that kind of flexibility adds resilience, and that's going to ensure that your portfolio will last throughout a long lifetime. So what I always tell people is, look, instead of obsessing over reaching some arbitrary number like $1 million, or, you'll even see higher numbers, right? Instead of that, right, I think the better thing to do is ask the question, what kind of life do I want? And how can I make that life work with what I already have? All right, so you've seen how retirement at 60 with under $1 million can work, from, income and tax strategy and healthcare planning and lifestyle design. But how do you actually figure out if you can do it, right? What steps should you take to evaluate your own situation and decide whether the strategy is realistic or not? And that's what we're going to cover next. So the first step in the, quote unquote, under $1 million retirement assessment framework would be to stop thinking in terms of just savings totals and instead start thinking in terms of inputs and outcomes. And, in other words, okay, how much income will you realistically need? Then how much will come from outside sources like Social Security, pensions, part-time work? Then you really do have to spend some time and figure out how much do you actually need to withdraw from your portfolio. Then if the gap between your spending needs and your guaranteed income is relatively small and your portfolio can cover that with a sustainable withdrawal strategy, you're probably in much better shape than you think. Next, you got to factor in taxes, right? Are you drawing primarily from traditional IRAs, or do you have a mix of account types? That's something I talk about a lot for people, before you retire. That last 5 or 10 years is critical to build that balance between account types and make sure you don't only have all your savings in a 401k, right? So this is going to be the next step in the assessment. And then you got to ask questions like, do I have room in low tax brackets for Roth conversions, or, managing my income somehow? Or are you at risk of triggering, like Social Security taxation down the road, and so on? And then you've got to evaluate healthcare, right? Can you bridge that gap between when you retire and Medicare with ACA coverage? Or are you going to have to find some type of private solution? And if ACA, does seem viable, can you keep your income low enough to qualify for subsidies? Or if your spouse is still working, does your spouse have coverage options that might help? And then finally, say, look, you got to take a hard look at your lifestyle. This is where the trade-offs are probably going to come in the most. Are you willing to relocate? Are you willing to downsize or cut expenses if needed? Or are you planning for a high cost lifestyle? That's going to completely change the math on whether you can make it work on a lower portfolio balance or not, because all of these pieces work together. But I think, if they're coordinated the right way, my conclusion is that a lot of people, they actually can retire at 60 even without a 7-figure portfolio, as long as the right strategies are in place. So now that you understand why retiring at 60 with under $1 million is not only possible, but potentially optimal when you implement strategic income replacement and tax optimization and healthcare planning and lifestyle design, you can evaluate whether this approach works for your specific situation. And if you want personalized guidance on determining whether you can retire at 60 with your current savings level, fill out the questionnaire in the description, and I'll send you a customized video analyzing your specific circumstances and showing you exactly how to optimize your approach for a successful retirement. All right, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.